Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all the participants of International Conference for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure 2021. My name is Sandeep Pondrik and I am the Director General of ICDRI. I welcome all the participants on the second day of the International Conference. We had a great day yesterday. We started with the inaugural session in which we heard global leaders, including Honorable Prime Ministers of India, United Kingdom, Fiji, and Italy on their vision of how to achieve climate and disaster resilience, and also what are the actions urgently need to be taken for achieving that. As Prime Minister Modi said, no one is safe till everyone is safe, and in our quest for resilience, we should not leave behind any community, any place, or any economy. The second session of the day was on health infrastructure, where policymakers and experts discussed the impact of COVID-19 not only on health infrastructure, but also on other infrastructure systems. And one of the key takeaways of the session was what Ms. Lauren Brown said, that one of the important things in tackling COVID-19 is to put factual information in the public domain so as to prevent the spread of misinformation. The next session was on global risk and resilience assessments, where experts from leading institutions in the world discussed risk and resilience assessments which need to be taken. And as Professor Jim Hall of Oxford University said, that these tools and data analysis will enable us to design better interventions as per the need of the societies and economies all over the world. The next session and the last session of the day was where we heard high-level functionaries, including Dr. P.K. Mishra, the Principal Secretary to Prime Minister of India, Mr. Akim Steiner, the Administrator of UNDP, and Ms. Mami Mizotori, the UNDRR Chief. While Dr. P.K. Mishra brought out the significance of need of countries to leapfrog to integrated planning for infrastructure systems using the latest data analytics and tools, Mr. Akim Steiner brought out the fact that only 16% of the stimulus packages announced by countries are addressing green recovery or green development. And Ms. Mami Mizotori made a strong statement that we were never on road to climate resilience even before COVID-19. So yesterday was a great day with visionary speeches and scintillating discussions. We are now moving into the second day of the conference, and we are starting the day with a very, very important topic, that is climate risk and resilience of small island developing states. As all of us are aware that small island developing states are prone to extreme weather events and climate change threats. They also have the additional constraints of remoteness from markets as well as connectivity issues. They have critical challenges as well as significant opportunities which can lead us to resilience. As the Honorable Prime Minister of Fiji in his speech yesterday said, there are no shortcuts to resilience. It is a process of planning and execution. So we will be discussing these issues in this session. I will be now handing over the session to Ms. Noel O'Brown. Ms. Brown is the Principal Climate Change and specialist in the Asian Development Bank, and she has large experience working in Africa as well as East Asia on the issue of climate change in DFID and ADB and other multilateral organizations. Over to you, Ms. Brown.
Thank you very much, Mr. Director General. I'm very pleased today So let me begin with warm greetings from the Asian Development Bank in Manila. Our keynote speaker today is Dame Meg Taylor, and let me introduce you to her. Dame Meg Taylor is a national of Papua New Guinea, and since 2014, she has been Secretary General of the Pacific Islands Forum, the first woman to hold that position. Under her leadership the Pacific Island Forum has revitalized its approach to regionalism through the Framework for Pacific Regionalism and has guided the forum's reinvigorated engagement as a collective entity under the Blue Pacific identity. Dame Meg is a lawyer by training, and she began her professional life as private secretary to Chief Minister Michael Somare in PNG. She was admitted to the bar in 1977, and she has practiced both public and private law. Dame Meg attended Harvard Law School in 1985, where she obtained a master's in law. Prior to her appointment as Secretary General, Dame Meg was appointed the Vice President of the Office of Compliance Advisor Ombudsman of the World Bank Group in 1999. She set up the CAO and led the office for 15 years, establishing a rich body of work on accountability and recourse for communities impacted by projects supported by the private sector arms of the World Bank Group. Under her leadership, CAO has become internationally recognized for its cutting-edge work in addressing corporate community conflict around the globe. Dame Meg has served as ambassador of PNG to the United States, Mexico, and Canada. She has been recognized by her government for her exemplary public service in 2002 and was made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire. As Secretary General, Dame Meg also carries the role of Pacific Ocean Commissioner and as such advocates for the secure future of Pacific people based on sustainable development, management and conservation of the Pacific Ocean and its resources. And without further ado, let me welcome Dame Meg.
Thank you very much. And let me just say how delighted I am to be with you all this afternoon. So Your Excellencies and distinguished panelists and ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon from Suva here in Fiji, and thank you for the opportunity to address this virtual conference on a topic that is pertinent to small island developing states across the Pacific. Small island developing states face unique vulnerabilities, and most especially here in the Pacific region. We are now faced with a three-pronged crisis: the crippling impact of COVID-19, the devastating effects of climate change and disasters, and the fragile economic well-being of our region, which has been exacerbated by the current pandemic. At the core of the Blue Pacific's resilient development agenda is a fundamental need to reduce the vulnerability and exposure of our people, communities, and infrastructure to risks emanating from climate change, natural hazards, as well as health epidemics and pandemics. While this is our aim, our countries are constantly faced with cascading risks occurring in parallel, such as the recent experience by the Pacific Island countries in responding concurrently to COVID-19, Tropical Cyclone Yasa, Ana, and Harold. And this often puts significant pressure on public systems of small administrations and the role of government to manage the economic impacts from those risks. Pacific Island Forum leaders have recognized climate change as the single greatest threat to our Blue Pacific region. Each year, more frequent and severe cyclones, floods, and king tides bear down on the Pacific, wreaking devastation and winding back years of development gains. Disaster-related economic losses are higher in the Pacific Islands than almost anywhere else in the world. Indeed, 4 Category 5 cyclones have hit our region since 2015. And just this year, 3 cyclones have already wreaked havoc in Fiji. Cyclone Pam in 2015 caused damages equivalent to 64% of Vanuatu's GDP. In 2016, Cyclone Winston wreaked havoc in Fiji with damages totaling 31% of GDP. In 2018, Cyclone Gita caused destruction in Tonga, equivalent to 38% of GDP. So these are just a few examples of how climate-exacerbated disasters can wipe out decades of development gain in a matter of hours. Ladies and gentlemen, the Pacific is faced with a constant state of recovery, from disaster-related destruction to public and private infrastructure. This has exacerbated the debt burden on Pacific Island governments, which has further worsened due to COVID-19. Despite these challenges, our Pacific leaders continue to be proactive in the global fight against climate change. Following their strongest ever climate change declaration in 2019, the Kanaka 2 Declaration of Urgent Climate Action Now. This declaration calls for climate-smart development towards achieving a 1.5 degrees by the end of this century, essential to safeguarding the future of our blue Pacific continent. Globally, our region is the first to have adopted a regionally integrated approach to resilience through the Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, which seeks to enhance resilience to climate change and disasters, promote low-carbon development, and strengthen disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. The Pacific Resilience Partnership brings together government, private sector, civil society, and development partners to realise the goals of the FIDP. A valuable lesson learned from the onset in ensuing impacts of COVID-19 is that our world is interconnected and the impacts of transboundary issues are unavoidable. This year, 2021, will no doubt test our Blue Pacific resilience. What more can we do to retain resilience in the face of multiple threats that we are forced to contend with? This is an opportunity for our region, for the world at large, to consider climate-smart response and recovery measures. Over the months and years to come, economies will recover. But this is a chance for nations to plan and build back better, to include the most vulnerable in those plans, and to shape 21st century economies and societies in ways that are healthy, clean, safe, and more resilient, while also focusing on the overall well-being of our human condition. Let me turn to the challenges and opportunities in Pacific Island countries in incorporating resilience infrastructure systems in their development agenda. Many of our members already recognise the importance of integrating resilient infrastructure systems in their development agenda. This is reflected in their national development plans, strategies, infrastructure investment plans, or country program pipelines to global funds such as the Green Climate Fund. Your Excellencies, let me share with you 3 key points on how we can better respond to the infrastructure needs of the SIDS. Firstly, a key challenge that we have observed in the Pacific in the implementation of infrastructure projects is the lack of close coordination between line ministry leads on infrastructure, on the projects, and national planning focal points. If we had coordination, it would ensure the sustainability of infrastructure projects and the budgeting of any subsequent maintenance costs that may arise, without placing undue stress on the national budget processes. In Tuvalu, the government has recently established a special infrastructure fund. This is currently 100% domestically funded. However, there is an intention that donors can contribute up to 10% of the value of the future infrastructure investment projects or ongoing maintenance cost. So so donor support for such initiatives is critical. The approach in Kiribati with the South Tarawa Road Rehabilitation Project was supported by the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank and the Government of Australia. And it includes climate proofing with the intent for no maintenance cost over the next 30 years. Secondly, during disaster events, both public and private infrastructure are damaged. While there is momentum in climate-proofing public infrastructure, support for building resilient private infrastructure, including residential homes, remains limited. This is due in part to the lack of appropriate building codes and affordable insurance options because of the associated costs. Both government and development partners can have a role in subsidising costs to ensure the resilience of private infrastructure. And thirdly, we in the Pacific need to transform our development model so that we are not always dependent on external support. We need to be more innovative in finding sustainable solutions to our challenges. An example of this is the work progressed on the Pacific Resilience Facility, a unique, forward-looking, Pacific-owned and led initiative aimed at mobilizing up to $1.5 billion to allow the region to invest in upfront, low quantum and high impact, small scale community resilience, building and disaster preparedness infrastructure projects. A global pledging conference is planned for the second half of 2021, and any support from the private sector and international community is most welcome. Ladies and gentlemen, the climate change and disaster crisis are cross-cutting. Both require a holistic and whole-of-government approach. They are crises that also require government to reach out to civil society and the private sector as integrated, innovative solutions are needed. For Pacific Island countries, this is an opportune time to prioritise risk-informed and risk-considered development planning. This will enable our infrastructure systems and facilities to withstand unforeseen pressure from the impacts of climate change and disasters, including pandemics such as COVID-19. Infrastructure development that supports building back better will be a key part of the second phase of COVID-19 recovery efforts for Pacific countries to help stimulate their economies and get people back to work. Countries must prioritise infrastructure planning and investments with high economic returns, short payback, and strong multiplier effects. In closing, allow me to reaffirm 2 points. Firstly, innovative solutions within our region should be encouraged and supported. And secondly, sustainable and genuine partnerships are needed to enable a resilient pathway for infrastructure development in the Pacific. Pacific. I look forward to the support of all development partners in making this reality in our Blue Pacific region a reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dame Meg, for those very insightful words. You've really highlighted the challenges that the Pacific is facing. Those huge numbers in terms of GDP losses with the tropical cyclones since 2015 are really striking figures in terms of percentages of GDP. And then even the recent ones in the last 12 months with TC Harold and Yai, etc. And also very much appreciate your insights into the recommendations that you've given us today. These points about close coordination, the support for building resilience of private infrastructure, the focus on building codes and insurance, and also your initiative on the building the Pacific Resilience Facility, and the fact that you will have a pledging conference later in 2021. This notion of the need to support innovative solutions is I think heard loud and clear from you for each of the SIDS. So I know your schedule is extremely busy. So I want to say thank you on behalf of the organizers and the participants today for giving us the time, and very much appreciate all of the work that you've done with PIF over the years. Thank you. Let me move along now and introduce you to our panelists and our discussants for today. I hope that you can see everybody. Oh, and also one of Dame Meg's colleagues will be joining us also for the remainder of the session. Our first panelist today is Ms. Vasiti Soko. She has spent many years working with the government of Fiji, and she is now serving as the director for the National Disaster Management Office in Fiji. She is skilled in GIS, databases, environmental awareness, report writing, geography, and cartography. So we're very pleased to have you with us today. Our second speaker will be Mr. Mamoru Satoru, who is the advisor for the Global Environment Department of JICA in the government of Japan. Now, Mr. Mamoru has been working with JICA for 26 years, and he has served in a range of fields, including global environment, disaster risk reduction, and sustainable development. He joined the Global Environment Department of JICA in June 2020, and he is now assigned as the Chief Advisor for the promotion of the regional initiative on solid waste management in the Pacific. This work is being implemented through Japan's technical cooperation with the Secretary of the Pacific Environment Program, SCREP. So welcome to you, Mr. Mamoru, for this panel. Our third panelist is Ms. Barbara Reichsen. She is the team leader for the economic cooperation, investment, and agriculture at the European Union delegation for the Pacific, based in Suva, Fiji. Now, Barbara believes that addressing climate change and promoting green economic growth will be cornerstones of sustainable development in the Pacific region. Working in a team with 7 enthusiastic and experienced program managers and thematic experts, she is the lead for the EU-funded programs to support diversified, sustainable, and resilient economic growth to strengthen economic governance. Barbara graduated from Wageningen University in the Netherlands with a Master of Crop Science. She has also completed a Masters of European Governance and Administration combined with the University of Potsdam and the Sorbonne. Since 2005, she has been working with the European Union with a focus on rural development and development cooperation. Outside of the office, she combines her passion for gardening with the loving care for her 3 children. Then our fourth member of today's session will be Mr. Robert Johnsey. Robert is the Chief Investment Officer for the Australian Infrastructure Financing Facility for the Pacific now. And prior to joining AIFFP, Rob spent 20 years with the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank, including as ADB's Regional Director for the South Pacific from 2014 to 2018. And also as the World Bank's Regional Coordinator from 2009 to 2014. So he brings a very in-depth experience with the Pacific. In these roles, Rob has been involved in mobilizing over $1.2 billion in new financing for the region, including for major infrastructure projects such as the South Tarawa Road project that Meg referred to, also the Avatu Port in Cook Islands, the ICT cables for Samoa and Tonga, airport runway construction and rehabilitation in several countries, and also a lot of work in renewable energy generation. So thank you to everybody for joining us. I'm going to begin now with some questions to Ms. Soko. And I'd just like you to begin with sharing your experience on the impact impact of the recent catastrophic events, such as the tropical cyclones that have been impacting Fiji and various sectors of the economy and critical infrastructure. Thank you, Ms. Sokol.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. For Fiji's case, since Tropical Cyclone Winston in 2016, which was a Cat 5 cyclone, number of people affected equivalates to 540,400. Number of evacuation centers activated at that time, 758. That was a Category 5 cyclone, and we matched it against Tropical Cyclone Yasa that happened last year. The number of people affected was 139, with numbers of evacuation center activated 312. This gives us an idea of the implications and the category of cyclones that have been hitting our region that is causing people to either be severely affected, but also causing displacement across the board here in Fiji. With regards to the pattern of the cyclone, what we've noted in our studies here, since 2019 to 2016, an average of one cyclone is experienced in Fiji. However, from 2017 to this year, an average of 3 cyclones are now being experienced in Fiji. And just for last year alone and this year, Tropical Cyclone Harold with Category 4 cyclone, we responded within the confinement of COVID-19. So Fiji was already experiencing Tropical Cyclone Sarai, which was a Category 3. While we were still responding to Category 3 cyclone, we had COVID-19. And so restrictions were put in place before TC Harold hit Fiji. So in the context of the implications on our infrastructure, not only has it been severely affected by the recent cyclone, but also implications to the life of Fijians. COVID-19 across the world has severely affected our economy. Fiji has been bombarded not only with COVID-19, with TC Harold that hit Fiji in 2019, a Category 4, and then we were again hit by TC Yasa in this year, followed by Anna, which accompanied a lot of rain. So our infrastructure was exposed at all levels. Having said that, the importance of implementing resilient mechanism in place to ensure that investment are put to good use. And this is something the Fijian government is working towards through the endorsement of the National Disaster Risk Reduction Policy in 2019.
And can I ask you specifically, Vasiti, where do you see the infrastructure of vulnerability and disaster risks? Can you maybe focus in on that and how you see the differentiated risk?
Sure. I'll give an example in this case. In 2000, after TC Winston, the impacts after TC Winston affected a lot of our infrastructures. The Fijian government put a lot of emphasis on rebuilding schools and public building. And I'm happy to report that when we had TC Yasa, the 68 of these public schools, public building that was within the path of TC Yasa maintained minimal damage. That shows the significant, the importance of resilient development and including the mitigation of disaster risk reduction into our development. We've noted through the increased number of residential homes that have been affected every year in an aftermath of a cyclone. There is a need for Fiji, which we are currently doing, reviewing our national building code to ensure that the residential homes are also able to withstand category all cyclone winds that hits our region. Again, pointing out the importance of resilient building that will not only save lives, but also save money in future.
And you've started to talk about some of the government policies. You've made reference to the building code. Do you want to elaborate the work that the government of Fiji is doing?
Sure. So for the Fijian government, we align ourselves to different aspects of international frameworks. We report to the Sendai framework. We also report to the Paris Agreement, the SDG goals, the Boy Declaration. Through those international alignment, we develop national policies, such as the Green Growth Framework for Fiji, the Displacement Guideline, the National Development Plan, and as I'd mentioned earlier, the National Disaster Risk Reduction Policy. In these policies are elements of resilient building and a resilient economy. The Fijian government is very particular and is moving towards nature-based solution. So the need for us to actually look into localized knowledge and see how best we can adhere to those knowledge to ensure that we not only save lives, but also save money and build back better.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think you've really shared with the participants those catastrophic events that are impacting Fiji. And also with that, the importance of preparing your infrastructure for those events, and then the importance of how government policy is supporting those efforts with your aligning with the international frameworks, but then matching your national policy for those. So thank you very much for sharing that experience from Fiji. I would now like to direct some questions to Mr. Mimura. Mr. Mimura, from your experience of implementing infrastructure projects in the Pacific Island countries, what mechanisms have been adopted to integrate resilience into infrastructure planning and development?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And small island countries have this advantage of narrowness, remoteness, and diffusion. So special consideration for these is required for development. They are under high exposure to natural hazards and vulnerability to climate change. In particular, these characteristics increase disaster risks, as well as the damage caused by disasters and delayed recovery. So disaster resilient infrastructure facilities are needed to reduce disaster risk and damage. And they also secure access for restoration work after disasters. And I think it is necessary to apply appropriate technologies that meet the severe natural conditions of island countries. And we are striving to improve the quality of infrastructure facilities, such as resistance to cyclones. I'll talk about some cases. Bridge replacement project in Samoa, in its capital, just opened last year, incorporates those factors into its design. The bridge construction project uses 100-year flood-resistant designs and salt-resistant materials. In case of Tonga, their wind farm have a structure that allows them to lie down in strong cyclone winds. Including us, the developing partners support construction of high-quality infrastructures to protect vulnerable land. Above all, it cannot be done without the administrative capacity for the island nation to formulate and implement policies and the budget for the maintenance of facilities. So human resource and the capacity development is indispensable for island countries to do these things autonomously. For many years, we have provided financial assistance for infrastructures to small island countries, as well as support for human resources development. Every year, we invite people in charge of disaster management from the Pacific and the Caribbean islands for training courses. And last year's course was forced to be conducted remotely due to COVID-19, but it provides an opportunity to learn about soft and hard from our disaster risk reduction and Build Back Better experience. We believe that not only financial assistance, but also capacity and human resource development is indispensable for the introduction of appropriate quality infrastructure in the Pacific Islands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now for Ms. Bixen, what are the different initiatives undertaken by the European Union that have worked in addressing disaster and climate risks that they've supported the PICs to enhance resilience?
Yes, thank you very much. Namaste, good afternoon, and a heartfelt Buddha Pinaka from the European Union delegation in Fiji. As you may know, climate action is at the heart of the European priorities. In 2019, the European Commission has presented its ambitious European Green Deal, which is guiding Europe in the fight against climate change in close collaboration with its international partners. With the European Green Deal, the European Union will scale up its climate-related actions, and we will increase our efforts enhancing resilience in Europe, worldwide, and definitely also here in the Pacific region. Already now, we are very much engaged in addressing climate and disaster risks. For example, we are currently collaborating with the government of Samoa through policy dialogue to support the development of resilient infrastructures. This policy dialogue takes place in the context of a 25 million euro budget support program. We experience a great mutual commitment with our partner countries here in the Pacific, notably when addressing climate change and building disaster resilience through budget support. It is the strong advantage of budget support that it puts our partner countries into the driving seat regarding the development and the implementation of climate and disaster resilience targeting policies and reforms. Another interesting example is the scaling up of Pacific adaptation project. This $80 million project is currently under implementation in 10 Pacific Island countries. It contributes to the implementation of the 2017-2030 Framework for Resilient Development in the Pacific, which has been endorsed by the Pacific leaders in 2016, as well as the Paris Agreement. This unique project distinguishes itself from former projects because it is designed as a response to lessons learned from prior actions successfully implemented under the Global Climate Change Alliance Plus. The Global Climate Change Alliance Plus is a European flagship initiative which is supporting small island developing states to increase their resilience to climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara. Mr. Mamura, can I come back to you and ask you to highlight some of the learnings and the challenges that you've faced while implementing those infrastructure projects in the Pacific?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Since the Pacific Island countries are small in both population and economy, it is necessary to secure a budget for their own expenses and persons in charge of project management. even when facilities are being developed with the support of partners, securing administrative officers with these experience and skills is essential. In small island countries, the most of construction materials are often imported from overseas, so which adds a transportation cost. The high cost is a headache for all the administrative officers as well as the development partners. Combined with the high labor cost, construction costs, sometimes tens of % higher than making the same in Asia. But small island countries are very vulnerable and they need quality infrastructure that are as good as or better than continental nations. This picture is about the bridge project in Samoa, as I mentioned before, and the next one is the Tonga wind vane. We need this kind of high quality infrastructure, especially in the small and vulnerable island, but the cost is a very big headache. And when we think about the efficiency or economic efficiency of the project, the beneficiary population in small island is relatively small, and the economic value of the asset which was protected by being developed facility is also low in the island. So the cost benefit analysis figures for infrastructure development are always low in small island countries. Yeah, this is a very headache for the development partners when they explain the economic adequacy of the projects. However, this is a matter of life, and island may disappear while we are concerned about the economic figures. So as for island nations, we need to change the way of thinking and interpret the adequacy of the project. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And Barbara, can I also ask you to highlight some of the major challenges that the European Union has highlighted with implementing projects in the Pacific?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for the question. Same question, almost same answer, also from us. There are two major challenges I would like to highlight here. And the first one for us is the high frequency of natural disasters in the Pacific. And secondly, it's very similar to what Mr. Mimura Satoru already mentioned. It is the small size of Pacific island countries and their population and the resulting high cost of disaster-resilient infrastructure. Climate change has influenced the prevalence of natural disasters, and the Pacific countries are no exceptions in this. Actually, the Pacific is one of the most disaster-prone regions in the world, and in terms of recurrence, severity, and the scope of natural hazards. The region is particularly affected by natural disasters, such as tropical cyclones, as we already heard from the first speaker, droughts, or flooding, causing significant economic damage. Since my arrival here in Fiji 6 months ago, I already witnessed two major cyclones, Tisiasa and Tisiana, an earthquake, and a tsunami warning. Now, this might not mean much for many of us here in the audience, but if you come from a small country like the Netherlands in Europe, these events, and especially their frequency, are quite impressive. I noticed that responding to such events occupies the limited capacities and financial resources of governments, distracting them from long-term reform efforts. I therefore feel that upfront preparedness and the capacity to reduce such risks deserves our attention now more than ever. It means investing in strengthening of early warning systems for natural hazards and improving the institutional arrangements for risk management and disaster preparedness. The other major challenge that I mentioned relates to the unique geographic situation of the countries in the Pacific. The Pacific Island countries are among the most remote places on Earth, with beautiful dreamery beaches, and small populations are dispersed over many islands. It is not rocket science to realize that this comes with a high transaction costs. For example, for transportation, as already highlighted, or the import of building material. As a result, the very high cost of disaster resilient infrastructure are even further increased. And with that, I pass over back to our moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And I think we've heard some really key points there, for us all to take away. This need for the infrastructure to be resilient to cyclones, this questions about the operation and maintenance of infrastructure after investments are constructed, the importance of capacity development. We've heard about the EU initiatives, specifically about the Green Deal, but also your Pacific adaptation project, scaling up adaptation efforts, and then these challenges. I'm not going to go back to that. In the interest of time, I'm going to move along and come back to Ms. Soko. Could I ask you to highlight the high priority areas of Fiji's infrastructure, which requires attention over the next 5 years, particularly in relation to long-term building of resilience?
Thank you very much. I just have 4 very specific ones for us this afternoon. The first one is a robust national regulation related to resilience. This includes building codes and other sectoral standards that are priority. Fiji, in the last month or so, have developed a technical working group for disaster resilient infrastructure, which is a mixture of both the private sector as well as government stakeholders. The key finding of this technical working group is to ensure that we share each other's projects and lesson learned and knowledge to ensure that we embed or embrace each other's development within the confinement of resilient infrastructure. The second one is resilient recovery codes and standards to be applied in the course of resilient recovery efforts for infrastructure. As I mentioned, over the years with the different cyclones that we've had, infrastructure stands to be the highest sector with the most incurred costs. For that reason, the need for the Pacific to have resilient infrastructure has never been needed than ever before. And therefore, the technical working group will be looking into these codes and standards to ensure that every development within the infrastructure sector is resilient or climate proof to some extent. The third one is the disaster data for infrastructure is a gap. This has been alluded earlier by the previous speaker. The role of disaster loss, the data for infrastructure, method of its collection and reporting, this needs to be strengthened. Lesson learned from previous projects that have been implemented in Fiji, the need to localize the development of this methodology to ensure that we are able to rationalize with the recommendations that are within this report. As I'd mentioned earlier, the methodology and the collections is very much in need to be localized so that it's easier to adapt, considering climate change impacts in the Pacific is more prominent now. And the final one is just the inclusion of private sector standards and disaster that are also relevant for the private sector. Fiji government has taken the initiative by including the private sector in the technical working group for disaster resilient infrastructure to ensure that we speak the same language, to ensure that the policies that the government develops adhere to the needs of also the private sector, because they contribute to the economy as well.
Can I just ask you very briefly, just in 1 minute, can you explain how does the government of Fiji use the technical and scientific data to support risk-based approaches? Just very briefly.
Okay, thank you. I was just for that answer. I mean, I was going to give you a breakdown of the Fiji. For Fiji's case, 27% of Fiji population lives within 1 kilometer of the coastline. 76% live within 5 kilometers of the coastline. So you can imagine the populated area in Fiji in terms of infrastructure stress because of the current locations of our population. So when it comes to use of science, the development of nature-based solution is what the government of Fiji is now investing into. The use of hybrid seawall, this includes mangroves and vetiver, to ensure that villages that need to be relocated are improvised in the near future so that further studies can be done to them before a final decision is made in regards to their relocation. We also use vetiver grass as a solution towards landslide. We've just relocated, we've done, okay. I was going to add more, but
sorry, I can see lots of questions also coming in from the audience. So Mr. Mamura, would you recommend that the development needs, how would you recommend that the development needs and priorities as highlighted by Fiji can be addressed?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think the building codes is very important to save lives of the people, and we JICA have been provided the technical cooperation, the training courses for building to improve the building code in the developing countries, and also the response and recovery from the big disasters. I can introduce the several new initiatives underway in Fiji. Fijian government and the JICA have signed a disaster standby loan contract in 2019, and it is the first case in the Pacific region. And based on the agreement, about 20 million US dollar was disbursed for the disaster caused by the Cyclone Harold last year. So, and also ADB and JICA collaborating to mitigate the flood risks in Nadi, the international, nearby the international airport of the country. Yeah,
thank you very much, Mr. Mabura. Barbara, can I come to you and just briefly, could you share some of your recommendations?
Yes. Only 2 days ago, in the build-up of to the COP26, Fiji's Prime Minister Bainimarama called for stronger commitment and collaboration in driving comprehensive action to combat climate change and to build climate resilient societies. So keeping this commitment as a top priority on the political agenda is a key element to continue addressing climate change. I also would like to congratulate Fiji on its efforts towards the draft climate change bill, which is a very comprehensive piece of legislation aiming at embedding Fiji's commitments to the Paris Agreement into national law and therefore further translating its official ambition into action. I'm pleased to say that Europe is committed to support Fiji in its front-runner role in the fight against climate change. For the coming 7 years, our target is to dedicate 30% of our financial assistance to climate-related actions. But we will not stop here. Europe has more to offer than financial support alone. And an example that I would like to mention is about the use of technical and scientific data for risk management and disaster preparedness and the response. And in particular, the use of Copernicus data and services. Copernicus is Europe's Earth observation program. It provides, on a daily basis, 12 terabytes of Earth observation open and free data. It is the third largest data provider in the world after Amazon and Google. These data coming from Copernicus can inform evidence-based policies and interventions on disaster preparedness and response. As is the case in other parts of the world, the European Union stands ready to support countries in the Pacific region to get access to those data themselves. We can also provide expertise, know-how, and training to increase the uptake of Copernicus data. And these data can help to improve the efficiency and the robustness of civil protection measures, thus increasing the resilience of the entire region to natural and man-made disasters. And by that, I give back the floor.
Thank you very much.
Noelle.
We have a huge discussion, a huge region for a very short time. And I'm going to hand over now to our discussant, Rob Johnsey. Rob, with all your years of experience based in the Pacific, working with the World Bank, ADB, and now the AIFFP, it would be really good to hear some of the highlights that you've taken from the discussion so far.
Thank you very much, Noelle, and let me thank all the panelists. I'd particularly like to acknowledge Dame Meg, while she has had to leave. She's an absolute Pacific legend, an illustrious career both with the PNG government and the World Bank before 2 successful terms as the Secretary General of the Forum, and a leader in outlining the vision of a blue Pacific continent, which I'll come back to. One of the things I've heard from all of the speakers is highlighting just how vulnerable small, remote Pacific Island communities are. The Pacific really is on the front line of dealing with both climate change and disasters. Just as one small factoid, since 1950, the Pacific has experienced almost 2,500 cyclones. That's an average of about 40 cyclones a year, causing about 10,000 deaths in that time. And as Dame Meg noted, several Category 5 cyclones just since 2015, 3 of them, Cyclone Pam, Cyclone Winston, Cyclone Gita, causing over $1 billion of damage to the island economies. I think as Fiji Prime Minister Bainimarama and NDMO Director Vasiti have noted, disasters cost Fiji, for instance, about $100 million a year on average. That's about 2% of GDP each year, every year, lost from disasters. And obviously climate change is going to exacerbate these risks, particularly but not only for the low-lying atoll states. I think, as Dame Meg reminded us, also worth remembering that risks come in many forms. Thankfully, the Pacific to date has managed to avoid the worst of the COVID pandemic, but we do see risks increasing, including in Papua New Guinea. Dengue and measles outbreaks in the Pacific over the past few years have highlighted vulnerabilities, and the economic impact from border closures, even when countries have been able to resist the virus, has been tremendous. Fiji, economy is likely to contract about 20% this year as a result of COVID. So many risks. But despite all of that, one of the things I hear is, and I think again, Dame Meg reminded us, and Pacific leaders have been determined that the Pacific has also proven resilient despite its vulnerabilities. And I think this is something Dame Meg and Pacific leaders have highlighted with their vision of a blue Pacific continent. As Samoan Prime Minister Tuleapa told me once, the Pacific are not just SIDS, small island developing states. The PM said they are the boss, big ocean states. And I think it's worth remembering Pacific Island, Pacific people have been voyagers for millennium. The Pacific people are custodians of the world's largest ocean, covering a quarter of the globe. Kiribati, just as an example, a population of 100,000 people, but an exclusive economic zone, the same size as continental India. So I think, a lot of experience dealing with vulnerabilities, dealing with disasters, a very resilient population. And the starting point to me for any discussion about building resilience has to be about how do partners like us listen to and respond to the priorities and the advice from Pacific people themselves. I think Dame Meg highlighted the importance of overcoming what she described as the constant state of recovery. I heard several consistent themes coming through the presentation by most speakers about what this might mean in terms of solutions. First, I think I heard a message that we all need to support Pacific countries to build their own capacity to respond, to build buffers. It's just one example. Small states over the past decade have worked together to dramatically increase the revenues they get from their fisheries resources. And I think by mechanisms like this, the countries themselves build economic buffers, build their own capacity to respond. Second, I heard a message coming through most speakers that external financing needs to be provided very flexibly in a way that supports Pacific countries' own priorities and capacity to prepare for and respond to disaster. Both Barbara and Mimura-san highlighted the way the European Union and Japan are increasingly providing budget support, very flexible financing to be able to help Pacific countries respond and to put them in the driver's seat in terms of developing and implementing climate change strategies. And this is something that banks and other partners like Australia are also considering. And I think Dame Meg outlined the Forum Secretariat's proposal to establish a Pacific Resilience Facility, again to support Pacific communities build resilience to disasters. So, a clear message about the importance of donors providing partners providing financing in very flexible ways. The third theme I heard coming through most presentations was the need for preparedness and resilience to be built into all infrastructure investments. Fiji Prime Minister Bainimarama and NDMO Director Vasiti spoke previously about the power of planning and the importance of building back better. And I think a highlight of this, schools and other assets that Fiji was able to rebuild after Cyclone Winston in 2016 were able to survive Cyclone Yasa more recently. Similarly, I think Mimura-san emphasized the importance of high quality infrastructure building to a standard that requires limited maintenance for long periods of time, such as the South Tarawa Road. And I think a clear message that partners need to support domestic efforts to ensure appropriate long-term financing for infrastructure maintenance, rather than just building new assets, whether that's through budget support, through more project-specific interventions. And the fourth theme I heard coming through most presentations was that a new approach means bringing in the private sector. There's potentially a couple of elements to this. One is about how to expand insurance coverage for households, building standards, and that's something Dame Meg and Mumura-san and Visiti all touched on. And similarly, particularly at a time when governments are facing limited capacity to expand spending, particularly as a result of COVID, how do we look to attract new private investment, whether that's in renewable energy generation or providing infrastructure services to government in a way that won't increase debts for Pacific governments. Finally, if you'll allow me, I just want to note Australia's obviously committed to working with Pacific countries and other partners to support the Pacific Zone efforts to build resilience. I think the Prime Minister has announced a major Pacific step up, including giving Pacific people opportunities to more closely work either in Australia or to increase Pacific exports to Australia. The Prime Minister also announced that Australia would provide $500 million over 5 years from 2020, specifically to help Pacific countries with renewable energy, climate change, disaster preparedness. That's part of our annual $1.4 billion cooperation program with the region. And of course, we're very pleased with the new infrastructure financing facility that should make $2 billion of financing available to the Pacific over the next few years. But of course, we're only one part of the solution. We need to work with Pacific Island countries, with other partners, to reflect Pacific countries and Pacific people own vision and priority. So thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Rob, for that excellent summary. We have quite a few questions coming in from the audience. So if I could address the first of the questions to Ms. Soko, based on your experience, what kind of support, hand-holding would the Pacific SIDS require to achieve disaster and climate resilience for infrastructure?
Oh, thank you very much. The question is quite general. For it to be a bit more specific, if I speak on building code, as alluded earlier, Fiji, we've done our groundwork. Now we're looking for, or we are in need of a technical assistance who's an expert, not only in putting together our legislations and the work that already been done, but also empowering the building code to have the resilient component in it. This is something that the Fijian government is very passionate about, to ensure that all developments moving forward, since Winston has a resilient component in it. So from Fiji's, with regards to the building code, the fact that we need to update that. This was done back in the 90s. The need for us to have further support on technical assistance or technical expert to bring in that resilient component and to bring the document together before it's tabled back to government. And there are so many other elements. For instance, for the director and DMOs in the Pacific, the different needs that rises from their different area of expertise. Again, for preparedness component in Fiji, the Fijian government, together with Japan, are looking to extend our tsunami siren. With that extension of the tsunami siren, the need for us to also invest into the facilitation of buoys that can also act as tide gauge. So the equipment and the technical expertise are two things that need to be considered when bringing further support to the Fijian people, and the fact that we need to localize the the terms of reference for those that come to work in the Pacific, to ensure that the reports that are done will be implemented and in a way that is also useful for government to further refine in future.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a really excellent example just about how much work is involved in just implementing the sirens for tsunamis. And can I bring that an associated question to Mr. Mamura? What is your view on the technical and scientific data that is currently missing for the development of disaster resilient infrastructure?
Thank you very much. Due to the lack of the facilities to get the data, we have been working with World Meteorology organizations about enhancement the capacity of the data collection and weather forecasting in the Pacific, but the islands are so much scattered, and it's not easy to get the sufficient data covering all over the Pacific. And also the lack of the number of officials who deal with such a business. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mamura. And I just have time maybe to ask one question to Barbara. And I know it's a short time you've been in the Pacific, but maybe do you have any comments on the role of the private sector, especially micro, small, medium enterprises, and how they can contribute to resilient infrastructure? If you can just share with your thoughts with us briefly.
Sorry, I had a little bit problems with unmuting the system. Yes, thank you very much for your question. And indeed, I've been here only for a very short period of time. And but it's good that you also raise the role of the private sector here in the Pacific in this field of interest. Actually, what exactly would be the role of the private sector is not so much my expertise, to say it like that, but certainly what we make as a policy here at the European Union is that we very much would like to involve and to stimulate private sector investments in Fiji in general, but of course, very much targeted on climate change and disaster resilience. So this has a very strong, is very much in our focus. It's one of our priorities. We are just at the start of our new investment program. So we are just building the whole environment to be in the situation to enable private sector investments more. But certainly it will have a focus on climate change and disaster resilience.
Okay. So yeah. I can see that, thank you very much, Barbara. I can feel that the curtain is closing in on us. So before I wrap up, I really just want to say thank you very much to Dame Meg and the team at the PIFs. Very much appreciate your time. To Mr. Mamura, to Ms. Bixon, to Ms. Soko, thank you very much for fielding questions. I think Robert Johnsey gave an excellent summary, and I think I want to just leave you with some of those key points. everybody today has just brought out the sheer number and intensity of the hazards that are facing the Pacific countries. This cannot be understated. And in terms of other points we've heard, the huge importance of seeing these small island states as big ocean states. They are responsible for huge parts of the ocean. And the need to listen to the people from the SIDS as we take recommendations of how to move forward. We've heard a lot about building capacity. That capacity is included in the example of the revenue generation and the huge successes around the fishery sector. We've also heard about development partner and the need for these flexible financing arrangements. That's a very clear message to us. We need to build in resilience and preparedness into all of the infrastructure. Not just I think even into the design, but also planning and location are factors that we really need to consider. And then private sector. Barbara has touched on the role that the European Union is taking, but we've heard about things like the building codes, especially for the private sector. We've touched on insurance, and we know that there's a whole range of insurance initiatives being explored in the Pacific, from the full sovereign insurance to micro level household insurance. So I think am I correct that I'm now over time? And so I'm going to hand back to the CDRI team. And once again, thank you very much to all the participants.
Thank you so much, Noel. This was really a very enriching and wide-ranging discussion on the perhaps one of the most important and critical challenges before us about how to make the small island developing states resilient to climate and disasters. We had many important points discussed, but I think two quotes I am taking with me. The one is that SIDS are in a constant state of recovery, and the other that SIDS should be called not small island developing states, but big ocean states, because they cover so much of ocean. So with that, we will be closing this session. CDRI will be working on the critical challenge and opportunities of small island developing states. CDRI is building up a program, co-creating a program with our member countries and organizations in consultation with the small island developing states, the already established mechanisms and facilities, and obviously our members and member countries and organizations. We will also have a discussion on the Caribbean region in the evening, that is 8 p.m. India time, where we will discuss the specific issues related to Caribbean. So thank you everyone for joining this session, and we will be back at 14:30 India time for an exciting session on innovations and emerging technologies. Hope to see you back to discuss and to see and to learn about what is happening on the cutting edge of technologies in the climate and disaster resilience arena. Thank you. We will be back at 14:30.